or was it a relationship? Here's the thing. I know TT got upset with me when I said that she was too clingy. It was given too much too soon.
This video does not confirm or diagnose any medical condition. Any references to health are presented strictly as allegations discussed within a broader commentary context. What follows is not spectacle. It is the examination of a claim, one that has unsettled conversations in private long before it reached public view. Behind red carpets and curated interviews, public life often appears seamless. Careers move forward. Images remain polished. Narratives are carefully maintained. But from time to time, a voice emerges that challenges that stability. In this instance, it was Tasha K, speaking on her platform with a tone noticeably more restrained than usual. Measured, deliberate, controlled. She suggested that what she was about to describe was not casual rumor, but something she believed had circulated quietly within certain circles for years, referenced in private, avoided in public, and protected by silence. At the center of her account was Teyana Taylor. According to Tasha K, the issue extended beyond personal conflict or celebrity tension. She framed it as a matter involving alleged undisclosed health concerns, claims she said were supported by documentation and confidential conversations. These assertions remain unverified, yet the seriousness of the allegation shifted the atmosphere of the discussion immediately. She implied that if such concerns had existed, and if individuals close to the situation had not been fully informed, the implications would reach beyond reputation. They would touch trust, consent, responsibility, the kind of consequences that do not unfold loudly, but privately, through doubt, fear, and fractured relationships. The narrative then moved to a period following Teyana's divorce, described as emotionally vulnerable and publicly scrutinized. Tasha suggested that decisions made during that time may later have raised questions among those involved. She referenced Aaron Pierre, portraying the relationship as complicated and possibly strained by pressures unseen from the outside. In recounting additional allegations involving other individuals, including Amon Shumpert and other well-known figures, Tasha did not present formal accusations, but framed her commentary as a pattern. Relationships formed during what she described as a sensitive and uncertain window. The emphasis in her telling was not scandal for its own sake, but the possibility of undisclosed risk. It is important to underscore that these are claims made by a commentator, not findings established by verified evidence. Still, the emotional gravity of such allegations, if believed, would be difficult to ignore. Fear has a way of reshaping memory. Silence can feel heavier than confrontation. And once suspicion enters a relationship, clarity often disappears. Tasha further suggested that in industries built on image and access, sensitive matters are sometimes managed quietly. Non-disclosure agreements, private legal counsel, reputation management. These mechanisms, she implied, are designed to protect stability, not necessarily transparency. Whether or not they were used in this situation remains unproven, but the suggestion alone added weight to her narrative. What lingers is not certainty, but tension. The idea that people may have navigated private doubts while maintaining public composure. That relationships may have ended without full explanation. That fear of consequences, of exposure, of misunderstanding can alter behavior long before any headline appears. If even a fraction of these allegations were true, the cost would not simply be professional. It would be psychological, the erosion of trust, the quiet recalculations behind closed doors, the burden of not knowing who has been told what and when. But without verified confirmation, what remains is a story about perception and power, about how quickly narratives form, about how silence, once broken, can reverberate far beyond its original source. In situations like this, truth does not always arrive immediately. Sometimes it lingers beneath competing accounts, waiting. And in that waiting, reputations, relationships, and entire legacies stand suspended balance between what is claimed, what is known, and what may never be fully understood. Tasha argued that the most troubling aspect of the situation was not the alleged condition itself, but the silence surrounding it. In her view, the deeper concern was the possibility that conversations that should have taken place never did. That certain individuals, if her claims were accurate, may not have been given information they deserved. The implication was not loud, but it was heavy. Trust, once fractured at that level, does not mend easily. She returned to Aaron Pierre, describing him as relatively new to the intensity of public life, still adjusting to its expectations, its politics, its unspoken rules. According to her interpretation, his behavior following the relationship suggested confusion rather than calculation. She characterized him as emotionally unsettled, perhaps overwhelmed, as though he had entered circumstances he did not fully understand. In reflecting on their dynamic, she offered a personal assessment. She suggested the relationship appeared rushed, formed too quickly in the wake of a very public divorce. In her view, it carried the feeling of rebound rather than resolution. The implication was that it may have been less about stability and more about escape from scrutiny, from lingering controversy, from unresolved fear. What unsettled her, she said, was not gossip. It was the pattern, the timing, the repeated presence of secrecy and emotional volatility. The possibility that individuals may have stepped into something without fully understanding its weight. Gradually, the narrative shifted. No longer centered solely on romance, it moved toward the idea of risk, an alleged risk that, if real, extended beyond personal heartbreak. Tasha suggested that what was at stake was not simply reputation, but responsibility. Lowering her tone, she reframed the issue as one involving potential exposure rather than emotional fallout. She described what she believed to be a chain reaction, each subsequent relationship, in her telling, carrying implications if prior disclosures had not occurred. These claims remain unverified. Yet, she presented them as part of what she called a broader pattern of quiet containment. According to her commentary, powerful industries possess mechanisms for managing sensitive matters, confidential agreements, legal counsel, private advisories. Whether such mechanisms were used in this case is not established. But the suggestion introduced a broader question about how institutions respond when personal health and public image intersect. She emphasized that the timeline, as she understood it, raised concerns. If certain issues predated later relationships, she argued, then questions about consent and awareness naturally follow. Again, these were allegations, her interpretation of documents and conversations she claimed to have encountered. No independent confirmation was offered. Beyond the alleged medical implications, she described emotional shifts, distance, abrupt endings, changes in behavior. Relationships that seemed to dissolve without explanation. According to her account, at least one partner began asking difficult questions, questions that carried medical implications. When those questions surfaced, she said, the relationship ended quickly and without public clarity. Returning again to Aaron Pierre, she framed the relationship not as distraction, but as a turning point. In her telling, he appeared more invested, more emotionally open than others before him. And when it ended, she suggested that those around him observed signs of strain, withdrawal, anxiety, uncertainty. These descriptions remain subjective, drawn from her commentary rather than documented evaluation. She then described what she characterized as a quiet industry response, private conversations, cautious advisories, discreet medical consultations. No official announcements, no public acknowledgement. Only what she described as precautionary steps taken behind closed doors. Such claims, if true, would imply concern. But they remain allegations presented without independent verification. As the discussion widened, she raised the possibility that the situation may not have been limited to one or two relationships. She mentioned additional public figures, careful not to accuse directly, but suggesting proximity within overlapping social and professional spaces. Even the mention of Leonardo DiCaprio was framed as hypothetical, an illustration of how interconnected these circles can be, rather than a confirmed link. At that point, the tone of the conversation shifted from personal to systemic. If silence had played a role, she argued, then the real issue was not individual failure, but institutional culture. In her view, silence allows uncertainty to persist. It permits fear to grow in private. She concluded by returning to behavior, subtle signs of emotional imbalance, dependency, a search for reassurance. She interpreted these dynamics as possible indicators of deeper unease rather than simple incompatibility. Whether those interpretations are accurate remains unknown. What endures is not certainty, but tension, a narrative built on claims, implications, and unanswered questions. A story where reputation, vulnerability, and power intersect in ways that are difficult to untangle. And in that uncertainty, silence becomes its own presence, steady, unresolved, and impossible to ignore. In one of the more pointed moments of her commentary, Tasha described the imbalance she believed she was witnessing within the relationship. She portrayed it as emotionally uneven, one person in constant motion, the other appearing to seek reassurance. Her language was blunt, at times crude, but beneath it was a broader suggestion that the connection may have been less about partnership and more about comfort. According to her interpretation, the pace of public life left little room for stillness. Projects overlapped, travel rarely paused, appearances continued. Movement became constant. In her view, that movement may not have been accidental. She implied it functioned as insulation, something to fill space, to prevent reflection, to avoid difficult conversations that surface only in quiet moments. She described Teyana during that period as distant, guarded, and emotionally unavailable. Whether that perception was fair or incomplete remains uncertain. But the narrative she constructed suggested a pattern. Intimacy approached cautiously, and when it drew too close, it was met with retreat. Tasha argued that the end of certain relationships was not simply about incompatibility or fading affection. She suggested that information, something learned, something suspected, played a decisive role. Breakups, in her telling, were abrupt. There were no public explanations, no gradual unraveling, only silence. From there, she introduced what she called a phase of containment. She alleged that once the potential implications became clear within certain circles, reputation management intensified, narratives shifted, timelines blurred. Public explanations emphasized personal differences or professional demands rather than deeper concerns. These assertions remain unverified, yet they formed the foundation of her claim that perception was being carefully guided. In her account, speculation about infidelity and personality conflict served as distraction. The public debated what it could see. Meanwhile, she suggested more sensitive conversations remained private. She also described an emotional cost, sleeplessness, anxiety, withdrawal. Individuals, she claimed, were living with uncertainty, fearful of what answers might reveal. One person, unnamed, was said to have struggled privately for months before seeking clarity. These descriptions were presented as part of her narrative, not as independently confirmed fact. At that point, she argued, the situation ceased to revolve around a single individual. It became, in her framing, a matter of risk management. If the allegations ever reached mainstream scrutiny, she suggested, the consequences could extend to labels, studios, sponsors, institutions deeply invested in stability. According to her account, discussions began quietly. Legal counsel was consulted. Crisis strategies were prepared before any formal story appeared. She described an environment of controlled urgency, fear contained within boardrooms and private calls. Following the breakup with Aaron Pierre, Tasha alleged that image management became paramount. She suggested that narratives were adjusted and that public messaging grew more deliberate. She further claimed that subtle shifts in perception may have affected Aaron himself, his credibility questioned indirectly, his presence within certain spaces diminished. These claims remain her interpretation of events rather than documented proof. She framed this as the moment power entered the equation. In her view, once fear takes hold, influence moves quickly to contain it. Invitations change, opportunities cool, conversations happen out of sight. Whether these developments were coordinated responses or natural consequences of public scrutiny is not established. What remains is the tension between allegation and reality, perception and proof. In that tension, reputations stand exposed, not necessarily to confirmed facts, but to doubt. And doubt, once introduced, has its own gravity. In recounting the atmosphere surrounding these allegations, She spoke of Hollywood as an ecosystem sustained by silence. In her view, when that silence is threatened, the system does not collapse, it adapts. Narratives are adjusted. Attention is redirected. What might have been framed as a question of health becomes a story of heartbreak. What could have invited scrutiny instead dissolves into familiar headlines about infidelity, creative tension, or clashing personalities. The public debates romance. Behind closed doors, risk is assessed. She suggested that, for a time, this strategy worked. While audiences speculated about loyalty and ego, those with influence focused on containment. According to her account, certain individuals withdrew from public view. Appearances were scaled back. Conversations grew cautious. Routine interactions took on a legal tone. It was described to her as a kind of isolation without announcement. No visible barriers, only distance. Distance from events. Distance from questions. Distance from anything that might invite clarity. Then social media disrupted that control. Fragments of rumor surfaced in private messages and anonymous posts. Fans began noticing patterns: abrupt breakups, postponed projects, unexplained cancellations. Each unexplained decision created space for speculation. She claimed that contracts shifted quietly, that clauses were revisited, that projects were delayed without explanation. No official statements were issued, but in her telling, something had unsettled the room. When she returned to the relationship at the center of the conversation, her tone changed. She suggested it may have functioned less as romance and more as strategy, a mutually beneficial alignment that redirected attention at a critical moment. She pointed to timing, to optics, to the way new narratives can eclipse old questions. In her assessment, this was not necessarily about affection. It was about visibility, about buying time, about allowing certain matters to recede from public view while contracts were renegotiated and reputations recalibrated. These are her claims. They remain allegations. But what gave them weight was not the spectacle, it was the pattern she described. A pattern in which influence shapes perception, in which credibility can be softened without confrontation, in which questions fade, not because they are answered, but because they are no longer permitted oxygen. She spoke, too, about the emotional cost. Sleepless nights, panic, withdrawal, individuals retreating from public life without explanation. She described at least one person who disappeared from view for months, not in scandal, but in silence. Waiting, considering, perhaps fearing what private answers might mean if they ever became public knowledge. When she addressed the dynamic between the two individuals involved, she suggested that behavior once dismissed as insecurity might be reconsidered. A need for reassurance, a visible search for comfort. In hindsight, she implied, those gestures could be read not as weakness, but as anxiety, an instinctive response to something unspoken. By the end of her segment, the focus had shifted from personal drama to institutional reflex. She framed the situation as an example of how power protects itself. How stories can be delayed, softened, or buried when too many interests converge. She did not present documents. She did not name every individual she referenced. Instead, she left implications hanging, suggesting that more remained unseen. What lingered was not certainty, but unease. If even a fraction of these claims were accurate, the issue would extend beyond one relationship. It would speak to a culture in which reputation can outweigh transparency and silence can feel safer than confrontation. Not necessarily because guilt is proven, but because exposure carries consequences too large for any single career to absorb. This is where the story becomes less about personalities and more about trust. How many public narratives are carefully constructed to guide perception? How often does distraction arrive at precisely the right moment? And when crises are managed behind closed doors, who bears the private weight of decisions made in the name of preservation? The most unsettling element is not the possibility of scandal. It is the suggestion of systems that prioritize continuity over clarity, protection over disclosure. Systems in which individuals without leverage may carry burdens alone while others remain insulated. Whether these allegations withstand scrutiny remains to be seen. What cannot be ignored is the atmosphere they describe: fear moving quietly through powerful rooms, influence operating without spectacle, and the fragile line between image and reality. Because when silence becomes strategy, trust erodes slowly. Not with headlines, but with absence. Not with confession, but with control. And once doubt takes root, it does not disappear easily.